There are excavation reports that don't quite make sense, not because they are vague or poorly documented, but because the details recorded in them seem to contradict what we understand about human anatomy in the 19th century, and perhaps even today, in scattered archives across different countries. There are references to graves whose dimensions simply do not match the expected proportions of human bodies from that era, and in some cases, they exceed them by a margin that is difficult to ignore. What makes this more unsettling is not the idea itself, but the fact that some of these records come from official surveys, field notes, and early archaeological documentation, written by professionals who had no obvious reason to fabricate what they were seeing. These were not storytellers or folklorists, but engineers, doctors, and historians tasked with cataloguing burial sites during railway expansions, urban construction, or early scientific expeditions. One recurring detail appears in multiple accounts: burial pits that are significantly longer and wider than necessary, sometimes measuring well beyond 2 meters in length, in periods and regions where the average human height rarely exceeded 1 meter and 70 centimeters. In isolation, this could be dismissed as imprecision, but the pattern begins to raise questions when similar anomalies appear in different locations, recorded years apart. In parts of North America, particularly during the 1800s, there were reports tied to mound excavations where elongated graves were documented, before being quickly reburied or dismissed as irregular soil formations. In Europe, especially in rural excavation logs, there are mentions of unusual burial dimensions without further elaboration, as if the observation itself was noted but not pursued. The immediate assumption is often that these were simply errors in measurement, or that the graves belonged to individuals of above average height, which is entirely possible. However, when the proportions exceed even the tallest recorded individuals of that time, the explanation becomes less straightforward and the absence of follow-up analysis becomes even more noticeable. So the question begins to form, not as a claim, but as a gap in understanding: were these graves truly anomalies caused by mundane factors? Or were they early hints of something that researchers either could not explain or chose not to explore further? When the conversation shifts from speculation to documentation, a few specific cases begin to surface, often cited in fragments, rarely examined in full context, and almost always surrounded by a layer of ambiguity that makes it difficult to separate verified data from later reinterpretation. One of the most frequently mentioned examples comes from 19th century North America, during a period when large-scale earthworks and burial mounds were being opened as part of expansion projects. The group most often associated with these excavations is the Smithsonian Institution, which, in the late 1800s, was involved in cataloging mound sites across regions like Ohio and the Mississippi Valley. Within these surveys, there are indeed references to graves and skeletal remains. But when examined through surviving official reports, most of the recorded skeletons fall within normal human variation, even when described as large or robust, however, outside the formal publications. Secondary sources and newspaper clippings from that era begin to tell a slightly different story. Articles from the late 1800s occasionally describe skeletons measuring well over 2 meters. Sometimes accompanied by exaggerated features or unusual burial conditions. These reports were often published in local papers where editorial standards varied widely, and sensationalism was not uncommon, especially when covering archaeological discoveries that captured public imagination. In Europe, similar patterns appear in scattered excavation logs and regional reports. where phrases like exceptional length or unusual proportions are noted without precise measurements or follow-up analysis. In many cases, these descriptions lack the detailed anatomical data required to confirm whether the graves themselves were oversized, or whether the interpretation of scale was influenced by incomplete excavation or degraded remains. What complicates the issue further is the preservation bias inherent in archaeology. Burial sites are rarely found in perfect condition, and soil movement, erosion, and partial excavation can distort the apparent size of a grave. A burial pit that appears excessively long may, in reality, have been extended by later disturbances, or may include space that was never occupied by a body at all. Even so, the persistence of these descriptions across different regions raises a subtle but important tension. On one hand, there is no widely accepted scientific evidence confirming the existence of humans with proportions far beyond known biological limits during the 19th century or earlier periods. On the other hand, there are enough scattered references to unusual graves that the question does not disappear entirely, especially when some of these accounts originate from individuals who were, at least in theory, documenting rather than speculating. The result is an uncomfortable middle ground, where the official record leans toward normal explanation, while peripheral sources continue to suggest that something did not entirely fit within those boundaries, if the records themselves are inconsistent. The real tension begins in how those records were handled, archived, and in some cases, quietly abandoned without deeper investigation, especially during a period when archaeology was still defining its own standards and methods. The 19th century was not a time of strict scientific rigor in excavation practices, and many discoveries were documented quickly, often without the controlled conditions that modern archaeology would require. One important reference point is the work later compiled by the Bureau of American Ethnology, which attempted to bring order to earlier mound excavations across the United States. Their reports, particularly toward the end of the 1800s, show a clear effort to standardize findings and dismiss exaggerated claims that had circulated in newspapers and local accounts. In doing so, they reinforced the conclusion that most skeletal remains fell within expected human ranges. But this is where the gap becomes noticeable, because the process of standardization often involves filtering, and filtering inevitably removes outliers, especially those that cannot be easily verified. If an excavation report included measurements that seemed implausible, and if those measurements could not be confirmed through preserved remains, the simplest resolution was to exclude them from official conclusions rather than attempt to reconcile them. That decision makes sense from a scientific perspective, but it also creates a blind spot, because it leaves open the possibility that some anomalies were never fully examined, not because they were proven false, but because they were inconvenient to categorize. When documentation is incomplete and physical evidence is no longer available, the line between error and omission becomes difficult to trace. There are also logistical factors that complicate the picture. Many early excavations were conducted during construction projects, where the priority was not preservation but clearance. Graves were opened, noted briefly, and then destroyed or reburied, often without detailed recording. If a burial pit appeared larger than expected, that observation might have been written down, but the opportunity to study it further was rarely preserved. What remains, then, is not a clear body of evidence, but a fragmented trail of observations, some formal, some informal, all filtered through the limitations of their time. And in that fragmentation, a question persists, not as proof of anything extraordinary, But as an unresolved inconsistency, were these oversized graves simply the result of poor measurement and degraded context? Or were some of them early observations that never received the level of scrutiny they required? Because once the physical evidence disappears, all that remains is the record, and if the record itself is incomplete, then the conclusion is never fully closed. Before I continue to the next step, a quick note that fits naturally here if you're interested in investigations like this, where documented records are examined beyond their surface conclusions. Subscribing to the channel helps you keep track of these deeper analyses as new cases are explored over time. By the time these fragmented records are compared against modern scientific understanding, the tension becomes more defined because today we have a much clearer picture of human biological limits, skeletal proportions, and the statistical range of height across historical populations. When these limits are applied to the claims found in 19th century reports, most of the more extreme interpretations begin to collapse under scrutiny. From a biological standpoint, individuals exceeding 2 meters in height are rare but entirely documented, even in earlier centuries, often associated with conditions like gigantism. However, when claims begin to extend beyond that, suggesting bodies approaching or exceeding 3 meters, the evidence quickly becomes absent in verified scientific literature. No preserved skeletons of that scale have been confirmed in credible academic contexts, and no museum collections, including those associated with institutions like the Smithsonian Institution, contain authenticated remains that would support such proportions. At the same time, archaeology provides multiple explanations for why graves might appear larger than the bodies they contain. And these explanations are grounded in observable patterns. Burial practices vary significantly across cultures and time periods, and in many cases, graves were intentionally oversized to include objects. Ritual space or symbolic alignment rather than to match the exact dimensions of the deceased. In other instances, graves were reused, expanded, or altered over time, creating composite burial spaces that do not reflect a single individual's size. There is also the issue of measurement distortion, which becomes especially relevant when dealing with partial remains. A skeleton that is not fully intact can easily be misinterpreted if the spacing between bones is reconstructed incorrectly, or if erosion has shifted elements out of their original position. In early excavations, where tools and techniques were far less precise, these kinds of errors were not only possible, but likely. Even the documentation itself introduces uncertainty, because many of the more extreme claims originate from secondary sources that lack verifiable data, without original measurements, photographs, or preserved remains. These accounts exist in a space where they cannot be fully validated, but also cannot be entirely disproven, especially when the primary evidence has long since been lost. And yet, despite all these explanations, one detail continues to stand out, not as proof, but as a pattern that resists complete dismissal: the repetition of unusual dimensions across unrelated reports, recorded in different regions by different observers over several decades. It is not enough to confirm anything extraordinary, but it is enough to raise a question that science alone does not fully close. Because while the limits of human biology are well understood, the completeness of historical documentation is not. When all of these fragments are brought into the present, the question is no longer about whether giants existed, or whether 19th century excavations uncovered something extraordinary that was later hidden. Because there is no solid, verifiable evidence to support that conclusion. What remains, instead, is something more subtle and, in some ways, More unsettling, the realization that a significant portion of early archaeological documentation exists in a grey zone where precision was inconsistent, preservation was limited, and interpretation was often influenced by the tools and expectations of the time. Today, archaeology operates under strict methodological standards with controlled excavations, digital mapping, and detailed recording of every layer and dimension. If a grave were discovered now with proportions that did not match known human anatomy, it would be measured, photographed, scanned, and analyzed across multiple disciplines before any conclusion was even considered. The margin for unexplained anomalies has become much smaller, not because anomalies cannot exist, but because the process for verifying them has become far more rigorous. And yet, the past does not retroactively update itself. Those 19th century excavation records remain exactly as they were written. Incomplete in some areas, overly simplified in others, and occasionally marked by observations that were never fully explored. When modern researchers revisit these documents, they are not uncovering new evidence, but reinterpreting old notes, often without access to the original physical context that would allow for definitive conclusions. This creates a unique situation where the limitations of the past intersect with the expectations of the present. On one side, science demands verifiable, repeatable evidence, and on that basis, the idea of graves containing bodies far beyond known human proportions does not hold. On the other side, there is a documented trail, however fragmented, of measurements, descriptions, and observations that were recorded but never fully resolved. So the real question today is not whether those graves prove anything extraordinary, but whether we are looking at a closed case, or at a historical dataset that was never complete to begin with, because whenever the cap and over time. Those conclusions can become so accepted that the original uncertainty is forgotten entirely. And in that sense, what survives from those excavation records is not proof of something hidden, but a reminder that sometimes the boundary between myth and documentation is not defined by what was found, but by how thoroughly it was examined